By 1979, the landscape for photography had changed quite a bit. Many photographers, many entry-level photographers, were really looking for a very simple camera, and Nikon lacked that. It also lacked what you might consider to be an amateur series, having killed off the Nikon line 2 years prior in 1977. The Nikon EM served to fill that role. That is, the entry-level camera that would appeal to first-time buyers and solely amateur photographers. That is, those who wanted to take good photographs but really had no intention of moving beyond that. Nikon went to great lengths to assure the camera buying public that this camera would uphold Nikon's commitment to quality. At the same time that Nikon released the EM, it also released a small series of lenses, and they branded these Nikon Lens Series E. Up to that point, we had the Nikkor lenses, and this line had served Nikon quite well from the early Nikomats and Nikromats all the way up to its current lineup at the time. And of course, many of Nikon's lenses were really intended for pros, or they were certainly built for use by pros, and if amateurs bought them, that was fine too. With the earliest cameras, the lenses had a silver band, much like this one did. A little chrome ring, and that was to indicate that although these were branded as Series E, that they weren't that far. They were really a closer cousin to the Nikkor brands. Later, Nikon dispensed with the silver ring, and you can see this is a slightly later lens. Production of the EM continued until 1982. A friend of mine bought one, and I got a chance to play around with it a little bit. I could definitely feel that it didn't have that same Nikon feel that you had come to expect from cameras. It wasn't that it was a bad camera, it just wasn't the same. So when you look at the top deck, you can see that this Nikon camera is very different from any Nikon camera than any other camera that the company had produced up to that point. So, for example, in your selector here, you had 3 choices. You had fully automatic, you had 1 manual speed of M90, 1/90th of a second, and of course you had B. So essentially you had 2 manual speeds. You had B and M90 and then fully auto. There was a widespread belief, there was a widespread desire, at least when it came to Nikon, that it at least have 1 manual speed should the batteries fail. A bit like the Nikon FE, the Nikon EM was battery dependent. And without a battery, you had very few choices. So let's take a quick look at the top deck here. So unlike any other camera that Nikon had produced up to that point, your choices here were extremely limited. You had fully automatic, you had M90, and then you had B. M90 was your manual speed of 1/90th of a second, and that would be if either the batteries died or you had no batteries in the camera. You also had a couple LEDs here. One was a battery check, another one was for exposure compensation, and you had your self-timer. Self-timer was purely manual. I believe this offered the traditional 10-second delay. The camera, although the lenses look different, continued to use Nikon's F-mount. At this point, there was just AI. They did not make any provision to use the older pre-AI Nikkor lenses. AI stood for auto indexing. So let's do a quick comparison of the lenses here. Aside from the branding and the lack of a silver ring, there are a couple notable things here. One is that it's missing what was known as the fork. In pre-AI lenses, the fork, these openings here were solid. When Nikon moved to the AI, which is auto-indexing, these little ears on each side, they had small cutouts in them, as you can see here. Mount-wise, they were identical. So the Nikon EM could take nearly all Nikkor lenses. It probably could not take those that would require mirror lockup, and there were probably, a couple specialized lenses that it couldn't take. But you could easily take a Nikkor lens and fit it on this body, or you could take this and attach it to any other Nikon body. However, for purist's sake and snobbery, you probably wouldn't be caught dead using an f2a with this Nikon Series E. All right, let's open the back. We'll take a quick look at that. Well, you know what? Let's flip it on the bottom and we'll take a real quick look. So this was a motor winder, a motor winder coupling, and here's the contacts for the motor winder. Here's the tripod socket, and it is in alignment with the center of the lens. This is your battery cover. This used two S76. I think it's S76 LR44, so used either silver oxide or lithium. In a pinch, you could always use the A76, the alkaline batteries, but if at all possible, always use either lithium or silver oxide. All right, opening up the back was very traditional. You simply pulled up on the rewind crank, and the back pops open. This is a very traditional setup, no surprises. Here's your pressure plate, and of course the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rails. So when you take your photo, the film will be as flat as possible. And of course, getting a sharp photo is always dependent upon you focusing correctly, and that the lens that you're using be of sufficient quality that it will record a sharp image. Film runs left to right. And here's your sprockets, and here's your take-up spool. Like I said, there's nothing extraordinary about this. This uses a vertically traveling metal blade shutter. You can see, there it is. As I mentioned, it has two manual speeds, should you lose battery power, B and M. B, of course, is bulb, and the shutter will remain open as long as I maintain that pressure on the shutter release. Once I lift my finger, the shutter closes. On the back is a little film minder holder, little film minder holder, and what you would do is tear off the end of the box of film and slip it inside. That way you always knew what kind of film you had loaded. Always worked best if you consistently use the same type of film. If you switch between black and white or color print and color slide, you'd also want to change this. Or you could, actually, I guess you could always write something down on a card and do a little drawing and put that in there too. Really doesn't matter. It's just a little frame for you to use. You'll notice that the film advance is a bit different in that it's hinged. Most film advances are solid. If we look at this Olympus OM1, for example, it's a solid piece. What's really unusual about this is I'm not sure how many other cameras use a hinged film advance. It's not a big deal, but it has a different feel to it. I think it just feels a little bit cheaper. In fact, everything about the camera feels just a little bit substandard. Not that it's not a bad camera, it just doesn't have that same solid Nikon feel to it. That's just my feeling. EM up here, I don't know what the EM stood for, but it's engraved and filled. It's not stenciled on. Same with the Nikon nameplate. That also is engraved and filled. This obviously also was a much smaller body. It was smaller I think it was smaller to make it appear more friendly and not make it seem so intimidating that, some of the other Nikon cameras often presented that image. But the Nikon EM was definitely intended for the amateur market and also the first-time buyer. In the mind of the first-time buyer, they could get Nikon quality without paying the premium that you often saw attached to Nikon cameras. This had a traditional hot shoe. I believe this had a dedicated flash. At one point in the early 2000s, as people were dumping film cameras as quickly as they could, I believe I bought an entire Nikon kit. I would have it today, but I gave it to somebody who really was in need of a camera, so I just gave him everything. I gave him the body, the flash. I don't think it had the winder, but it did have 3 lenses. And I believe the 3 lenses, I want to say it was a 50, a 35, and a 100. And they were the first generation because all 3 lenses had the silver ring. When peering through the viewfinder, you have a shutter speed scale that runs down the left. This uses a needle rather than a series of LEDs. And in the center, you have your split image surrounded by a ground glass collar. This was an aperture priority camera, so you would adjust the aperture until until you found your desired shutter speed, or until the shutter speed moved into, I think, a usable speed. This was not program auto exposure. This was aperture priority. And that fit well within Nikon's lineup of auto exposure cameras, and that would be the, the Nikon EL, ELW, EL2, and the FE. This is a fairly lightweight camera, and how lightweight? Well, let's take a look. 1 pound, 4.6 ounces. So you could say 1 pound, 5 ounces. So that in itself is a very lightweight camera. And so let's compare it with the Nikon FE, because I've talked about that enough. The Nikon FE with its 50mm lens weighs 1 pound, you could say 1 pound, 12 ounces. So that's a 7-ounce difference. Nearly, but not quite half a pound difference. There was very close scrutiny of this camera when it first arrived on the market. At that point, Nikon really only had 3 cameras on the market. It had the F2 series, and then it also had the Nikon FM and FE. The FM and FE were built on the same platform, but really looked like professional level cameras. The Nikon EM's body covering was much different from any other camera that it had produced. This is I don't even know what, it's sort of like a coarse grain leather. I don't believe it's leather. It's most likely a synthetic material, but it's made to resemble leather. If we look at the Nikon FE, for example, you can see that this has a very tight grain pattern. So if you look at the bodies front to back, you can see the differences in the two. Well, first of all, this certainly has a lot more choices, right? This has a full shutter speed selector dial. It has a different type of film advance. It has exposure compensation over here, selectable exposure compensation. And it also has your film speed setting dial with speeds running from 12 on up to 3200. The Nikon EM, in comparison, has a much more limited number of film speeds. So the film speed dial maxes out at 1600, whereas the film speed dial on this maxes out at 3200. As well, as I mentioned before, you had your exposure compensation, and I believe you just had a button here that would give you probably 1 or 1.5 stops, plus 1 or 1.5 stops exposure compensation. That was your battery check here. On the FE, your battery check is right here. Your frame counter's here and frame counter is here. If we put these side by side, you can see that the Nikon EM is a shorter camera. So it's shorter and not as wide as the Nikon FE. But that's no surprise because, as I mentioned, this camera really was intended for the amateur. So the lenses themselves were swappable. As I mentioned before, you could take an FE lens and you can easily mount it to any of the modern day Nikon lenses. I don't believe you could use these on the older FT2, FTN, and Nikon EL bodies, you know, the pre-auto indexing bodies. There was so much older Nikkor glass available, you know, why would you? And so what's my final rating for this camera? Well, it's an 8.6. In general, the camera has held up pretty well. A lot of these cameras that you'll see today are heavily soiled. Once cleaned up, most of or corroded, but like as I mentioned, that's really a maintenance issue by the owner, not really having to do anything with the camera itself. The build quality is better than you would expect from a plastic-bodied SLR, although it's not bad. Obviously, the features are limited because that was the intended market. But, you know, overall, it's still a very usable camera today. And so there we have it. This is a Nikon EM introduced in 1979. Nikon's first plastic-bodied SLR and first camera that was really intended purely for the amateur photographer. And like other photographic companies, it really led the way for Nikon to begin producing cameras that were solely intended for the amateur market. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and if there's a camera that you'd like me to talk about in the future video, please let me know in the comments below or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And I hope to see you on the next video.